Morning. In a break with tradition, we're going to try to start on time. We have a couple of folks who are still making their way over from the hotel, but with your indulgence, we're going to take care of a few introductory opening remarks and then hope that one of our first panelists, our authors, is here, and the second author for our first session is, we hope, on his way. Anyway, good morning. I'm Michael Foyer. I'm the Dean of the Ed School at the George Washington University, and I do this work over today and tomorrow in my capacity as the immediate past president and continuing board member of the National Academy of Education, so it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. I wanted to say a couple of words about the origins of this project. This started, as many of these things do, when Ken Pruitt and I were having a glass of wine at some event or another. Ken is the current president of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, but I've known Ken for a long time and was involved with him in a very important, I consider a very important project of the National Research Council of the other academy, so that's the National Academy of Sciences, the smaller one, you know. And that was a project on the uses of social science evidence, scientific evidence for public policy, which was a committee project that actually grew out of work that we had done at the NRC having to do with the scientific quality of education research, which is a lovely, came out as, I think, an interesting short book, also called Scientific Research and Education, and the names associated with that you may remember. It's a wonderful report, I think. Rich Shavelson, Lisa Town, and others were involved in that. I'll tell you one short anecdote about the origins of that, only because the person, I'm not going to name names, but the person who is implicated in this story is actually sitting here today. When I started thinking about that report, that project on the quality of education research, I called around to some of my friends in the business, my colleagues in various academic institutions, and I said to this one in particular, I said, hey, you know, we're planning to do an academy study on the scientific quality of education research. And this person's answer was, well, that's good. It's about time the academy did a short report. Which tipped me off to two things. First of all, that in our academies we have people with a good sense of humor, and second, that there is something about the quality of the scientific quality of education research, which maybe was worth plumbing a little bit more deeply, and that sort of, if anything, that remark energized me to go forward and keep working on that. As a result of that, we discovered that, in fact, one could substitute a lot of other fields into the debates that were brewing and swirling around the quality of education research. And one could imagine thinking of research having to do with criminal justice or with income maintenance, with other big policy topics where there was a growing interest in scientific evidence and in its various forms and with various uses. That, therefore, led us, after the Shavelson project, to think about expanding into a more general inquiry into the role of scientific evidence in public policy, which for many of us, of course, I mean, I've only been thinking about that now for 40 years, but it's been around for a long time. And as many of you know, this is a topic that is associated with people like Charles Lindblom and David Cohen, and of course Carol Weiss and others who have actually studied this question of what kinds of evidence and through what mechanisms can that evidence be actually useful for policymakers. So Ken took on the assignment of leading a committee at the NRC to look into that question a little bit more broadly than just in education. And the result is this book, which I would encourage you to have a look at in your spare time. And of course, all of these NAS reports are available on their website as free PDF downloads. So it's an interesting thing. Well, Ken and I were then talking about his work with the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and with my wonderful colleague Jim Pellegrino, who was the vice president of the Academy when I was the president. We sort of came up with this idea that this would be an opportunity to think about this question of evidence, to focus on a particular aspect of educational evidence, and then to think about doing something jointly between the two academies. And Tom, who is the executive director of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, will tell you a little bit more about that organization in a moment. But that's where this started. It was an idea to bring the two academies together, and then the idea was to focus on measurement, educational measurement, and its uses in policy and practice. So we came up with that idea, and then of course came the easy part, which was to identify authors and people who would actually be willing and able to contribute to an issue of the annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science and write papers for that volume. And sure enough, you guys said yes, which is just remarkable. I can't tell you how honored I feel and how grateful we are, the team that has been working on this, that our authors have actually come through and the papers actually came in on time. I mean, this is a violation of so many traditions, I can't tell you. But when we started realizing who are the authors and who's involved in this, I have to say, I'll paraphrase what President John Kennedy once said in a slightly different context, but I actually think it's not an exaggeration that there has not been assembled in this kind of a room the accumulated knowledge, experience, and wisdom that is represented here on issues of educational measurement and its uses ever, with the possible exception of when Bob Lynn and Lee Kronbach dined here alone. Bob Lynn, of blessed memory, one of my dearest mentors, colleagues, and friends, without whom I would never have succeeded in this line of work, going way back 30 years now. Anyway, so thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this. The volume, as you know, is organized. We went through various iterations of how to organize this kind of knowledge and thinking on these topics. And then we decided to try to do it by the main uses to which educational measures and assessment are intended or actually applied. There's all kinds of reasons why we still think that's a good sort of framing mechanism. And we hope that the volume with these papers and with some commentary that will be provided through this two-day gathering will be a real contribution to the field, to people who are continuing to study the uses and perhaps misuses of educational tests and assessments, the evolving context in which these kinds of tools are used. I think it's fair to say that of all the issues in education policy, the one that seems to be enduring over centuries is related to the question of how do we assess, how do we measure, how do we gauge teaching, learning, systems, and educational progress. So we hope that this volume will be a contribution that primarily looks ahead. And that was something else that my colleagues Jim Pellegrino and Amy Berman and I thought a lot about, and we want this volume to be kind of forward-looking, things are changing in the environment, things are changing in technology, things are changing in the way we have grown as a community of scholars and users on with these techniques and these methods. And it's a good opportunity now when I think it's fair to say that the appetite for robust scientific evidence, at least on the part of some people in the political world, seems to be at a low point. That a slight understatement, perhaps. But my sense is that the appetite will revive. And I think that by the time this volume comes out and then its contents percolates into the public and professional psyche, we will be ready to answer the questions about, okay, where to, what next, how can we do this better? And I think that's what this volume will be a contribution for. At least that's what I'm hoping. That said, we're going to have our first panel on some historical background. And before we do that, I am honored and most pleased to introduce my colleague, Jim Pellegrino, who once again made the mistake of picking up the phone when I called, and I ruined more of his leisure time. But please welcome Jim Pellegrino.
Good morning. I'm Jim Pellegrino from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and as is always the case when I deal with Michael, he ropes me into things, and when I follow him, he's already spent far more time talking than he was allotted. And he pretty much said everything I was planning to say, although I just want to add a few comments of my own and also some thanks. Most especially, I want to thank all the authors and discussants are here. I mean, Michael has sort of said this already, but when you look at this lineup, this is like the freaking all-star game. You don't even need to read the bios, okay? If you don't know these players, you've been in some other space. It's just an amazing group of people. And as Mike said, this is the right group of people to talk about these topics about assessment in terms of how we use educational assessment and how we should use it and what the future looks like. So I'm thrilled that we actually managed to get all of you to write. You actually wrote, and we have drafts. That's pretty amazing. We have an incredible group of discussants. And I think the whole logic that we had for having this meeting was to have an opportunity for the authors to share their thinking, their drafts, but with discussants and with each other so that we could essentially have a kind of mutual interaction and shaping of what the final product's going to look like. So I'm thrilled about that. I'm also thrilled that Tom, we managed to convince Tom to actually participate in this project with us, even though initially I would have to say, in a typical Foyer way, it was ill-formed. But that's the way it goes when I work with Mike. It's 20 years now, something like that, and he always concocts something new and usually finds a way for me to do more work. But I also want to thank Amy for all the work she's done to put this together, to pull this together, to coerce authors, and you will be hearing from her often when we follow this up. So I'm just gonna quit there again. The whole goal of this is to really get ideas out there, to discuss the perspectives and to share in a dialogue. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tom.
Hello. Welcome to Philly. I'm Tom Ketchkamethy. I'm the director of the American Academy, and more to the point, for this meeting, the executive editor of Annals of the American Academy. My job here is to just orient you a little bit in 5 quick minutes, I promise, to the work of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and more importantly to the Annals, which has been and continues to be the cornerstone sort of property of our Academy. So the orientation to the Academy begins back in 1889. We've been poking around in our archives a little bit, and on my desk on the second floor of this building, there is right now handwritten minutes from the first meeting of the American Academy, which was founded to do exactly what we're doing now, which was to address critical matters of social concern with the best that social science had to offer at the time. We've done that for 127 years, I guess, at this point. And we continue to do that through the Annals, which has published from 1890 until today, and took its current form someplace in the mid-teens, which was the form that you see now. 6 volumes a year, it's a pretty heavy lift for us. So it's 6 volumes a year, we're bi-monthly, and each volume is topical. So my job as executive editor is to do the amazing work of meeting with people like Amy and Mike and Jim to discuss issues like this and shape the volume in its early going, figure out whether their interests for examining educational assessment are compatible with our interests for vis-a-vis publishing through the Annals. I'll flesh that out in just a second. So I fly in early and work with our executive editors or our special editors for these topical volumes, and then I get to participate in authors' conferences like you, meet you all over wine and dinner. Some of you I already know. Most of you I have read. All of you I welcome here. So what the Annals does, and I brought just a couple of notes and a couple of props, I think it was put best by Kathleen Hall Jamieson. And by the way, you are in the house that Kathleen Hall Jamieson built. This is the Annenberg Public Policy Center, where we rent space on the 2nd floor. So Kathleen is a former president of my American Academy, and also a great fan of ours and what we do, a fellow of the Academy and so forth. So Kathleen said, I'm kind of paraphrasing and massaging it into my own, what the Annals is a scholarly voice that communicates knowledge of social phenomena accessibly to an audience of both academics and non-specialists. So with each of these curated volumes, topical volumes, that's pretty much what we like to accomplish. How do we do that? 1, demonstrate what good social science looks like. So systematic application of social science to critical social concerns. And 2, provision of perspectives on settled science as it applies to important policy concerns. I'll say that last part again because it's critical to our audience. Provision of perspectives on settled science as it applies to important social policy concerns. So the best way that I know how to sort of do this is by example. Given that we've been doing this 6-volume-a-year thing for over 100 years, well over 100 years, we go back, I'll just pick on a few volumes. I was looking for it in Emily's office before I came down, but I can't hold it in my hand. There's a 1928 volume, 140, on the American Negro, where you find in that same volume the first known journal article on residential segregation in American cities by Ernest Burgess, right next to an article by Thorsten Saline, a criminologist who was a president of our academy, right next to an article by Thorsten Saline about the Negro criminal, a statistical note, which is pretty much a systematic takedown about all the prevailing wisdom about black criminality back in that day, right next to an article by W.B. Du Bois on race relations in the United States. So this kind of all-star cast is what we most like to do. It's just a wonderful sort of evolution to be able to participate in. Then you go forward to 1964. Think about 1964 in the context. We published a volume then on city bosses and political machines. And then, this I'm holding in my hand, volume 452. This is The Police and Violence, published in 1980, and the special editor was Larry Sherman, who is going to be doing for us a volume on the police and violence again next year, or in 2020, actually. It's going to publish in 2020? I think January 20. I'm not looking at you, Michael. I'm looking at Emily. So we're revisiting some of this in the contemporary context. And then the effects of the Great Recession. Sheldon Danziger edited this one for us. This is kind of what the best minds were thinking a couple of years after the crash. This one published back in 2014, I think. And then my favorite recent example was just earlier this year. This was actually my boss, Ken Pruitt, and Richard Alba, What the Census Data Miss About American Diversity. I commend this one to you because it's a one, and we have a contributing author, Becca Maynard, actually wrote a piece for this one. No, that was That was another one. That was the July volume that you did a piece for that one. But the census data and American diversity. So what this does is kind of mashes up current demography with current thinking on racial categorization and makes sense of it for a broad and interdisciplinary public. So enough of the examples. What we tried, characteristic of all of these annals volumes, I think this is coming through, is sort of that they are topical. Elections in America, we did one right in advance of the 2016 election, not that it didn't made much of a difference. That they are interdisciplinary, that they are strongly empirical, and that they are policy relevant, but not necessarily, or, well, not politically activist. And there are lots and lots of examples that we can go to that illustrate all of these. So a note to you all as authors. When I think about you writing for the annals, I think mostly about your audience. So I'll tell you who your audience is. The best way that I think I can express this is to tell you that we're trying to reach three kind of groups. One, you want to talk to your colleagues. You do want to talk to your colleagues. I'm going to harp on and on about how you're not writing for your colleagues necessarily, but you want to talk to them. Scholars with experience in the topic at hand, colleagues of yours, you want them to learn something new. Scholars who are expert, but perhaps in another field, you want them to come to understand the state of science and inquiry in this topic on hand. So you want to be talking to a broader group of colleagues who are not necessarily represented by those of you who are in this room. And then policymakers, public servants, and others working to improve the human condition. What we want to do for them is arm them with knowledge, give them these perspectives on settled science that can speak to them in their day-to-day work. So it's to all of these different audiences that you're writing. What does that mean? It means accessibility, really, and your responsibilities are to write for colleagues who are not just your own. So here's where I get to harp about you're not just going into the technicalities of educational assessment and testing as if you were sitting here or at dinner tonight. You're talking to a broader audience than that. And that you want to keep your this is mostly the job of the special editors, is to keep the volume sort of curated and relevant in a more public way. But it can be somewhat, at least, in the top of your mind as well. So that's my little 5-minute spiel on who we are as an American Academy. I'm available to you through the rest of this conference. Look forward to talking to you throughout the days and at dinner tonight. And I'm going to introduce you to Emily Babson just quickly, who is our managing editor of the Annals and my associate director here at the Academy, who's just going to say a couple of quick words to you about production. So Emily is the person that you're going to be in touch with primarily as your papers are in production. So she's going to be the one who's doing all that stuff.
You want to define settled science first?
Oh, that's, no.
Good morning. As Tom said, I'm Emily Babson. I'm the managing editor. I will be emailing you primarily once I get your papers, and then through copy editing and proofreading. So I'll be very brief. In your packets, you all should have the author guidelines and the transfer of copyright form. So I would like, ideally, to get that transfer of copyright from you before you leave tomorrow. It would just make things easier if you signed it before you're out of the building. If not, you can always email it to me. The second thing is the author guidelines. Just briefly, a couple of things to note. Please pay attention to our reference style. It is particular, and we follow Chicago Manual of Style, but we also have our own style that trumps Chicago, and so that's where 99% of my queries will come to you from, is the reference list. So it's all detailed in there, but if you have any questions, I believe my email is on the copyright form, so you can reach out to me directly with any questions about the author guidelines or the copyright form. Thank you.
So I'm Amy Berman. I'm the Deputy Director of the National Academy of Education. And I, with Greg White, who's the Executive Director, want to welcome you all today. And thank you so much for engaging in this endeavor with us. The National Academy of Education has a very long history in examining assessment and measurement. It's an issue near and dear to many of our members, as many of you know, because you are our members in this room who study this issue day in and day out. Last year, we wrote a report on international assessments, the we being Judy Singer and Henry Braun, who are with us today, working on this issue, and you'll hear a little bit more about that also. An earlier report that we did in 2010 with the National Academy of Sciences. Many of you in this room also worked on that. I know Judy and Henry did, Scott Marion did, Lori Shepard did. And so, like I said, we have a long history of looking at assessment and how it can be best used. Jim got roped into another assignment as he was leaving being the vice president of the National Academy of Education, where we're working on testing comparability issues. And so the only thing I wanted to add to what Michael talked about the use of evidence and our strong commitment to the use of evidence is and to add to this notion of who our audience list is. When we were thinking about this project, before we were thinking about it as a volume, we were thinking of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and we were trying to figure out with the Department of Education at that point in time, like how could the scholarly knowledge in a room like this help school districts and states figure out what to do with their assessment systems? And how could the knowledge in a room like this help states who were thinking about applying for the pilot program under ESSA think about what that would look like and what categories of students they would have to be most cautious about in a pilot program, and how to be inclusive. And with the change of administration, sort of those conversations stalled a bit. And when we were regrouping, we were here. But again, I think just focusing on the notion of like, how do we make testing information usable and useful, and make sure that everybody is included in a way that is meaningful. So with that, I just want to do a couple of very small logistics. First of all, we are videotaping this with our hope that it goes up on our website at around the same time that the volume comes out. If anybody has a problem with being videotaped, please let me know afterwards, and we'll be sure to edit out any portions. That's one thing. And then the second thing is that when we do our speaking, our question and answers in the room, while the room is a great room and we will all be able to hear each other, if we could use the past microphone, it will make it so we can pick it up for the videoing. And I think she walked out of the room, so I might wait to thank Jessica, who works with AAPSS and has done an amazing job to set all of this up and organize this whole 2-day process for us. So make sure she knows I said thank you to her, but we will thank her again. And I think with that, we are going to start. The authors are getting 18 minutes each. I will have, 5-minute, 2-minute, 0 cards, and the discussants are having 12 minutes per paper. And I think that will start us off.